So, if you're new here, this isn't how we normally begin. But we've been in a series talking about Mr. Rogers, and we had this video that we've been playing the last few years, is what it feels like. And I kept having to hear my own voice, and so I decided that it would be easier to do this, and perhaps less cheesy. And I was wrong. Here's my second comment. Just while I'm on the topic, okay? Listen. Mr. Rogers was on air for, I don't know, whatever the math is, 1968 to 2001. And that man, every day, got home and took off his loafers and put on shoes that you had to tie. Nobody does that. Nobody puts shoes on that you have to tie when you get home. I forgot my Bible. So I think Mr. Rogers has been doing it wrong all these years. That's the takeaway. And last but not least, I knew that my children would just really enjoy this moment. So I wanted all of us to be a part of that. I want to say welcome again. My name is Matt Stone. I'm one of the pastors here. And if you are joining us for the first time, I promise this is not a normal way to begin. But we've been in a series called Hello Neighbor for the last few weeks as we've explored what it means for us to live out the greatest commandment, to love God and love your neighbor. A few years ago, Margaret's folks got me a smoker to smoke meat because I long had a desire and felt like I would be good at smoking meats. And I love consuming smoked meats, and so I wanted to have a device on which I could smoke the meats and then eat the meats. And so they got me such a device, and I quickly learned that one doesn't just automatically start as a great smoker of meat. It's very uncomfortable. They say, here's your grill, now go cook something, and then we're going to eat it. Very uncomfortable moment when you realize you have no idea what you're doing or how to do it, and what's the proper meat to select, and what's the seasoning that you put on it, and how long does it go in, and what is the fire made of, and how hot is the fire, and when do you take it off, and do you use the probe to see how hot the meat is, and do you wrap it in tinfoil, or do you wrap it in butcher paper? It's a very overwhelming process. That's what I'm trying to say. Very overwhelming process when you start because you don't know anything. Very uncomfortable, which I find to be true generally speaking in life. That when you go to learn a new thing, it is often uncomfortable in the early going because we're out of our element. We're out of the realm of what we are used to doing, and it requires that we learn something new. That can be a very uncomfortable thing. The truth is, what we've been talking about the last couple of weeks, neighboring is a new thing to learn, and it can be very uncomfortable, particularly if you're not one of those extroverts that just naturally does this stuff. Very uncomfortable to learn a new thing. But as time goes on, eventually you learn what kind of meat to buy, and you learn how to wrap it, and you learn how hot the heat ought to be, and you learn what kind of fire. Eventually, as time goes on, you learn a little bit more, and you grow in comfort. So as we've made our way through this series, I hope that you are growing a little bit in your comfort level with the idea of being a good neighbor, if that's not something that's been part of your life before. And I want to kind of wrap this series up with really some very practical ideas and suggestions about how you can live this in a meaningful way in your neighborhood or wherever you live. But before we do that, I want to say one thing one more time. If all of this sounds basic to you, right? If the idea of a Christian being a good neighbor, if the whole thing sounds a little bit basic to you, it's because it is. It is a very basic conversation. It's a very basic idea, and that's okay. It's okay for us to start at the beginning, particularly if you're new to church. If you're not new to church, if you grew up in church, then it's hard I think for most of us to grasp how daunting the task is to come into church, to come into faith later in life and try to figure out, what am I supposed to do? I'm learning a little bit about what I'm supposed to believe, but what do I do with all that? If you're new to church, then starting with the basics isn't a terrible idea, because another word for basic is foundation. right? What we've been talking about the last few weeks is foundational to Christian living. And particularly if you are new to faith, this is, I think, where we must start. Jesus says, what's the greatest commandment? Jesus says, love God with all your heart, soul, mind, and strength, and to love your neighbor as yourself. So that makes sense. But if this sounds basic to you and you believe yourself to be a more mature or advanced Christian, what I want to say to you is this. There is no more advanced Christian living than what we've been talking about. There isn't anything more mature than that. There's not anything more advanced in Christian living than loving your neighbor. This is the thing. This is it. We've made it about a whole bunch of other stuff, but this is the thing. If you are one of those who's been living a Christian life for a long time and you're kind of wondering, is this a little bit too simple for me? I want to invite you to pause that conversation again and start over. Because it is possible for us to know more about the Bible, and perhaps you do. It's possible for us to know more about who God is and God's nature and character, and perhaps you do. It's possible for us to have a deeper relationship with God, and perhaps you do. But friends, there is no more advanced living of Christian life than loving God and loving neighbor. This is the proper place to begin, whether you are new to church or whether you've been living a Christian life for perhaps even a little bit too long, so long that we forget sometimes what the main thing is. So we're starting with the main thing, and I hope that this will be a helpful reminder to you or introduction to you. So I want to get started with where we've been the last couple of weeks. Last couple of weeks, we've talked about the greatest commandment, what I just said, love God, love your neighbor. We talked about, it's hard to love someone when you don't know their names, and so we took a poll last week in which many of you lied, just unashamedly, you lied. Over half of you, or about half of you, say that you know the 8 closest neighbors to you, the 8 closest households to you. I think I figured out how you did this, by the way. Only 90 of you took the quiz. So the other 50 or 60 of you who were here last week, you get a 0. You failed that assignment. So I think perhaps we don't know as many as we think we do, and that's okay. But here's the deal. When Jesus said, love God, he did not say, love God and become an acquaintance. All right, for those of us who know the names of our neighbors, either a lot or a few, the call that Jesus offers to us is not love God and become an acquaintance. And that's really what knowing someone's name is. That moves you from stranger to acquaintance. But that's not what Jesus said. Jesus said, love God and love your neighbor. In the language of the authors of this book that I've told you about a few times, The Art of Neighboring, in their language, they talk about moving down the line. And I think this is a helpful concept, a helpful way to think about it, because you can place yourself wherever you need to be on this spectrum. But we talk about moving down the line from stranger to acquaintance. That's what knowing somebody's name does. And from acquaintance to neighbor. Neighbor in a rich and kind of biblical sense, where we are loving our neighbor, where we understand what's happening in their lives, where we are offering ourselves and our resources for the sake, not of ourselves, but for the sake of them and for their benefit. We need to move down the line from acquaintance to stranger, stranger to neighbor. That's the work that we need to do. But let's be clear about one distinction before we press forward. The distinction is between ulterior motives and ultimate motives. Because let's be clear about kind of how the world views the church. The world views the church in a very skeptical way. You can go look in the demographic data for Peachtree City and see that that's not an out there thing, that's a here thing, right? Our community views organized religion very skeptically, and frankly, we've earned it. Because we have tended to live a kind of bait and switch culture. Right? Because we so often operate out of ulterior motives that say, well, you're just being nice to me so that I'll come to your church. You're just being nice to me so that I will give you money. You're just being nice to me so that I will support your cause. That's an ulterior motive. And friends, that's not the end game for us. The ulterior motive, getting folks to come to church, is not the end game. Do we want folks to be a part of community? Absolutely. Of course we do. We believe that the story that we share together, the community that we share together, the God that we worship is important and that it matters for every person. We want more people to hear about that, no doubt about it. But the end game for neighboring is not and never ought to be to get people to come to church. It's something that extends far beyond that. And that's where we want to talk about not the ulterior motive for neighboring, but the ultimate motive for neighboring. And for that story, I want to turn to Luke chapter 5, and I want to tell you that this is a passage we actually looked at a couple of months ago. If you have your Bibles, I'd encourage you to turn to them in Luke 5. It's a passage we looked at, and I try not to repeat stories too frequently because, for goodness sake, there's a billion of them in here. So you would think that we would just keep finding new stories, but occasionally there's a story that just speaks out so strongly that I have to bring it to you again, because this time we're going to look at it from a different lens. In Luke 5, all the way back in October, we started a series with a story that we're going to look at today in Luke 5. It was the More Than Enough series. We looked in Luke's gospel at the meals that Jesus shares with various people and what we learned from those meals, who Jesus was eating with, how he was welcoming folks to the table, that kind of thing. And we started with this story that we're going to look at this morning. But we're going to look at it today from a slightly different lens, because I think it provides for us a glimpse of two things. The first is it provides a glimpse into the ultimate motive for which we are called to neighbor, and it provides a pathway for us. Right? As we think about, okay, but how do I neighbor? If I don't enjoy this, if I'm not sure how to do this, how should I begin? Well, this story, I think, provides us with a beautiful starting point, or a beautiful model that we can then deploy in our own neighborhoods. So Luke chapter 5 is where I'm going to start in verse 27. If you want to follow along, I'm just going to read about 2 or 3 verses real quick. It says, after this, Jesus went out and he saw a tax collector named Levi sitting at the tax booth. And Jesus said to him, follow me. And so Levi got up, left everything, and followed Jesus. And then Levi gave a great banquet for him in his house. And there was a large crowd of tax collectors and others sitting at the table with them. And later in this conversation, Jesus goes on to say something you may be familiar with. He kind of challenges the Pharisees, who are the folks who are just really following the rules. The thing that they care the most about is the rules, the rules, the rules, the rules. They just will bludgeon you with the rules. Jesus kind of confronts them and he says, look, I didn't come for those who are healthy. I came for those who are sick. I'm a healer. I came for those who are sick. So let me eat with them. That's the conversation that takes place later. But go back to the beginning of this story. Remember, and we talked about this back in October, but I know perhaps you might have forgotten some of it, and that's okay. Remember that tax collectors are terrible people. They're degenerates. They really are. They lie, they cheat, they steal, they beat, they rob, they kill. They do whatever they can and whatever they want to in order to collect the taxes, and that's who Jesus goes and gets. It's a stunning event in Jesus' ministry that never gets the credit that it deserves. Jesus goes to one of those guys, one of the enemies, and says, follow me. And it's exactly what Levi does. Levi follows Jesus. He leaves behind his old life, and he begins a new life. Notice what Levi does not do. Levi does not follow Jesus and change nothing. Levi does not follow Jesus and keep doing what he's been doing. Levi does not follow Jesus and forget about the world around him, because what he does next is the model for us. It's the model for us, and it speaks to the ultimate means, the ultimate motive, the ultimate purpose for which we neighbor. What he does next is he has a banquet for Jesus. Notice it's not Jesus throwing the banquet. It's one of Jesus' disciples who has a party. That's what we're talking about. He has a party and invites his friends over, the same degenerates that he was, right? The folks who are still robbing and beating and stealing and killing and all of the bad stuff. That's who Levi brings to his party so that they can meet the Jesus that he met. What Levi does is to craft an environment in which the people around him can meet Christ like he has, so that their lives can be changed just as his life has been changed. That's the model. Right? The model is that we create environments around us that make it possible for the people around us to meet the God whom we worship, to meet the Jesus who has saved our life, not just eternally, but here on earth. So that's what Levi has done, and it speaks to the ultimate motive, which was never about supporting an institution. It was never about getting all of his friends to come to synagogue on Saturdays. It was about facilitating an encounter with Jesus. Did Levi know how to do that? No. He had no idea. When Levi is inviting people to meet Jesus, there's no New Testament for them to read, for him to read, and then spout off to all of his friends, well, you should come because X, Y, and Z. This is what Paul says. There was no Paul. All that Levi knew how to do was to put people in front of Jesus and allow Jesus to do the work. Friends, that's our model. That's what it means to neighbor well. And let's be clear. So many of us think, even in a community like Peachtree City, we think everybody's already Christian. So what are we even talking about the neighboring thing for? Why would I need to create an environment where somebody can meet Jesus? Everybody's already a Christian. But the data doesn't support that, right? 6 years ago in 2017, there was a study done with the U.S. Census data, and it said that 40% of Peachtree City, 40% of the folks that live in Peachtree City were actively involved in a church. Well, that means that 60% aren't. Some of those might be Christians, but a Christian not involved or engaged in community is living not the abundant life that God desires for us. So 6 years ago, 60% of our community was not Christian. That number in 2021 went from 60 to 75%. 3 out of 4 of your neighbors aren't Christian. 3 out of 4 of your neighbors aren't involved in a Christian community. To sit back and say, well, all my neighbors are already Christian, perhaps you live in an anomaly, but I doubt it. The truth is, the opportunity is all around us. In the same way that Levi looked at his friends, looked at the people that he knew, and said, they need to meet this guy. That's the opportunity that you have before you. Your neighbors need to meet this guy. If they come to church, terrific, that's great. But the ultimate motive is for us to craft an environment, to build an environment, to create opportunities around us where our neighbors can meet the Jesus who changed our lives, where God can use us to change the lives of the people who live around us. So now let's just give a few just ideas, right? For some of us, like myself, this is a hard thing to wrap my head around because I'm not super extroverted, and those ideas don't come to me. So I just want to put a couple ideas in front of you. Some of them will work for you, and some of them won't. That's okay. Leave behind the stuff that doesn't make sense for your life and grab onto the stuff that makes sense for your life. Here's the first idea for you. Move to the front yard. Right? Your backyard is designed for isolation. It was built for isolation. That's why you have a fence around it, is so that you don't have to see your neighbor and your neighbor doesn't have to see you. Right? You don't have to see your neighbor's mess and they don't have to see your mess. Our lives have been increasingly built around the backyard. With the advent of air conditioning, TV, and backyard fences, we have moved off the front porch and into the backyard. Friends, move from the backyard to the front yard. That doesn't require any money from you. It doesn't require any time for you. The only thing that it requires for most of you is a move of about 50 feet. Just move 50 feet in the other direction, because when you do that, then suddenly your neighbors who are walking their dogs eventually will start cleaning up after their dogs, but also they might stop and talk to you. Your neighbors with kids playing in the streets eventually will throw a ball into your yard, and you'll have an opportunity to do an act of kindness for them and retrieve their ball. Right? When you move to the front yard, you are suddenly in an opportunity. You have created, just by a move of 50 feet, you have created an opportunity to meet the people around you, to move from stranger to acquaintance. And sometimes those conversations linger. Now, that will require some time from you, but when those conversations linger, you're moving from acquaintance to neighbor. Just move from the backyard to the front yard. The second idea is this: do what you love. Do what you're passionate about, but do it in a place that other people might see it. Don't assume that nobody else would care about what you care about. For me, I probably ought to consider moving the smoker from the backyard to the driveway for 2 reasons. People are generally very hungry in this country. 2, people are hungry for connection. Right? Look at the demographics. Go Google the demographics for Peachtree City. If you don't trust this as a national trend, trust it for a local trend. People are hungry for community. When you will do the things that you're passionate about, when you'll smoke the meat in the driveway, then suddenly folks they'll come to you. And you'll create an opportunity just by doing what you were already going to do anyways. You will have created an opportunity for community in your neighborhood. Here's my third idea. Extroverts, for the love of all that's holy, help a brother out. The introverts among us know how hard this is, and I'm one of them. The introverts among us know how hard it is to even think about spending time getting to know other people. I overheard a story before worship today of someone who said that they finally went to an event held by their neighbors, and it wasn't so bad. And then they said, half of them were psychos, but it wasn't so bad. For those introverts among us, we need you extroverts to do your thing. Play the role of connector. You are a gift to us. You have a gift. Use it. If you know Bill on the left of your house and Phil on the right of your house, but Bill and Phil don't know each other, introduce them. They might know each other. You can play the role of connector by the way that you use your gifts, particularly if you are an extrovert. Do your extroverting thing, but use it to connect people that haven't met each other, who might not otherwise ever have the courage to step out the front door and talk to their neighbors. And here's the last idea. Just host a gathering. Like, for instance, just spitballing here, on the second Sunday of February each year, perhaps since everybody in your neighborhood will be doing the same thing, perhaps you could invite them to come to your house and watch the Super Bowl with you. Host a gathering, right? Just have people over. There's no ulterior motive. It is just getting people together and getting to know them. Because when you create that kind of opportunity, then suddenly strangers become acquaintances. Acquaintances begin to share, hey, I'm struggling here because my wife left me a year ago and I don't know what I'm doing. I'm struggling. Acquaintances begin to share stories like, my husband died 6 months ago and I'm not sure how to survive. When you host a gathering like that, acquaintances transform before our eyes into neighbors, into friendships. We can begin to see the need that is around us and respond to it. That's how it works. We follow Levi by creating an environment, create an opportunity around us where people can meet Jesus. If they come to church, terrific. We want them to meet Jesus. It's time to move down the line. Wherever you are, it's time for you to move from stranger to acquaintance. If you already have been bragging about how many of your neighbors you know, it's time for you to move from acquaintance to neighbor. I want to close with a word from Fred Rogers. Fred Rogers, on August 31st of 2001, taped his last show. Well, it aired on August 31st of 2001. He taped it before that. And here's one of the very last things that he said on air. This is how you'll know you're grown up inside. When you're sure that what you're planning and doing are things that can be a real help to you and your neighbor. That's how you know when you're grown up inside. You're sure that the things that you're planning and doing are things that can be a real help to you and to your neighbor. Church, it's time to grow up. It's time. It's time to do things, to do real things, to help the people around us. It's time to stop yelling at each other over the disagreements. It's time to stop whining and complaining about what's not right with the world. Church, it's time to grow up and to take seriously the greatest commandment, to love God and love your neighbor.